Hey, welcome to another episode of the Typewriter video series. This is Joe Van Cleve. Today we're going to talk about using typewriters for serious writing and how we can fit that into a digital workflow. Well, these days in the 21st century, obviously people who are serious writers are going to be choosing the kinds of writing tools that are the most practical and expedient for them to get their work done, and that is a word processor program on a computer platform. Well, that wasn't always the case, of course. Back in the 20th century, manual typewriters and later electric typewriters were the norm, and even into the latter part of the 20th century when word processing became popular, a number of writers were still using paper and typewriters for at least part of their workflow. So I would like to today talk about how we can employ paper and typewriters in part of the process of serious writing. Well, first, let's talk about the writing process itself. The writing is a multi-step process. There are kind of three stages to it. The first stage is what I call the rough draft phase, which is where you basically get the raw ideas down on paper. The second phase of the writing process is really the hardest and the longest, and that is the editing phase, the revision phase, where you go from this rough gem of a piece that you constantly massage and work and rework and rewrite until you have a final polished gem. And then the final stage is really the finishing touches, what makes the difference between a mediocre piece and a really good piece. So for each one of those phases, there's kind of a different type of tool set that works best for that particular kind of writing. Now, one of the most important aspects in the writing process is being able to focus and concentrate on your writing. And this is especially true in that first stage of writing, the rough draft phase, where you might be struggling with writer's block, creativity, getting ideas, trying to get these basic concepts down on paper. This is where I would suggest that writing with paper, and especially mechanized writing with a typewriter, is really comes into its own, its forte. Because in the first draft phase of writing, you don't need to worry about final, polished looking writing. It's getting the words down, getting them recorded in some format, so later on you can go and polish them and rework them and massage them and wordsmith them and do all the stuff that writers do in that middle stage, okay? This, I really think, is where the typewriter comes in, because typewriter prints on paper, right? And it prints a physical document that you can look at and see. There are some ways, I think, that we can make this process optimized for typewriters in the rough draft phase. One of those is to consider, for us typewriter users, typewriter aficionados, typewriter hobbyists and collectors like I am, it's tempting to want to find the one perfect machine that types perfectly. It never has any skipping issues, spacing issues, the touch and feel is perfect, it looks beautiful. But you know, if you've been a typewriter collector for any length of time, you know that that kind of a machine doesn't really exist. And in the heyday of mechanical typewriters, they never existed either. Typewriters were never perfect. And that's the thing you have to realize. So if you're going to use typewriters as a tool for writing, the first thing you have to realize is it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to do perfect imprint. The letters don't have to print correctly, evenly, perfectly spaced. And the reason why is for the initial rough draft phase of writing, nobody else is going to see those except you. It is for your own private use. The only purpose for it is to get words down on paper, okay, get them documented, okay? So any machine can work. I would suggest the most important thing is a machine that you're comfortable with, that feels right and works for you. So it doesn't have to be a perfect machine. It can skip. It can put one letter on top of the other as long as you can read it. That's one of the most important thing. Okay. So first of all, the first thing there is it doesn't have to be a perfect machine. The second thing is to optimize the rough draft phase of writing with a typewriter. I highly recommend that you use double spacing. So that's the setting on most typewriters over on the left side of the left carriage knob. Use double spacing so you have room between each line that later on you can put corrections. You can cross things out and write corrections and revisions. Because there's that initial data dump of words on paper, and then you begin the revision process. The revision process is multi-step. It's multi-revisions, multiple stages of revisions. And the very first stage of that revision process will be hand revising your typescript on paper, crossing it out, writing stuff in the margins. From there, you go to the main part of the editing, which will be transcribing that onto a word processor and using the tool of the word processor for what it does best, which is moving words around. Okay, but for the purpose of writing the first draft, I think putting it on paper is a great idea. Now, here's a third idea that you might want to think about. Now, you or I are probably not going to be celebrated writers by the end of our life. We're not going to be studied by university scholars. But if you have the paper documents of your rough draft of the works that you've written on paper, and maybe the initial edit phase, those become a treasure house of documentation later on as to your working methodology. Because most people that are writing with word processors are not going to be storing the entire Word document in terms of all its revisions and forms. They're only going to be saving the final version probably. And it's a digital document. It means it constantly has to be resaved over and over again as the digital media erodes. Okay? Paper doesn't take any energy in order to archive. It is archivable unto itself. You don't need a team of IT professionals to maintain it and copy it over every few years. If you store it properly, it'll last for several hundred years. Okay? So that's the third thing about paper. It's a paper document. It is archival by nature. Okay? Now, let's talk about another way that you might want to decide upon to make the writing process with a typewriter, the first draft writing process, even more efficient. So one of the biggest hindrances to using a typewriter for writing is when you get to the bottom of the page, you have to stop, pull the paper out, and load up another sheet of paper. And that becomes a constant source of interruption and irritation. If you're in the middle of a creative outflow, and you want to get this thing down, you're just hot into it, and you have these great ideas, you don't want to stop. And that's one of the biggest problems with typewriters. Well, there were some famous, notable writers in the 20th century who took note of the same problem. And notable among them was Jack Kerouac, who you may know was one of the celebrated beat authors and wrote On the Road. And he wrote On the Road with a scroll of paper. It was a roll of teletype paper that he threaded into his machine and used that as a continuous typing experience. Now, I've played around with this idea for a few years, and let me show you what I've come up with. First of all, getting the 8.5 or 9-inch or 9.5-inch rolls of regular paper is really hard to do. I've looked, and there is tracing paper available, kind of like art paper for tracing, real thin paper that comes in 12-inch wide rolls. That isn't going to work for you unless you have a wide carriage machine. Okay, but if you have a normal carriage machine like this Corona Standard, where it really is designed for 8.5-inch wide, 9-inch wide paper, you're going to need something narrower. There is really narrow paper. That's this, adding machine cash register paper. Some of it you can get 6 inches wide, and it's thermal paper. and theoretically you could type on the back side, the non-thermal side. That's a little bit narrow. What I found, and it is a little bit narrow for real manuscript writing, but what I found was I went to my Napa Auto Parts store, and in the part of the store where they sell automotive painting supplies, they have these 700-foot rolls of paper that are used for masking off cars, and it's white paper. It's a little thicker than tracing paper. It's still pretty thin. It's 6 inches wide and it's white colored. Now, I had originally a few years ago made like a holder for this that would sit on a table or desk behind a typewriter, but a lot of my typing nowadays is done on a tray table, and so what I did with the tray table thingy is I made this wooden dowel and these 2 black foam core discs, and it sits down here in the legs of my tray table, and let me show you how that works. So I have the roll of paper on this wooden dowel, and it goes through the cardboard core of the paper, and I just have some discs of foam core with some screws in them, and it just simply holds them into the scissor-like legs of the tray table. Then you're just going to take the paper and you're going to go up here and you're going to thread it into the machine. So when you thread it in the machine, you're going to want to get the thing straight, so the edges of the paper are nice and straight, and this will ensure that it's going to feed straight. Okay? The next thing is setting your margins so they're within a character or 2 of the edge, so you can use as much of the paper as possible. What you'll find about using this method and why it's so cool is that you never have to stop. You can continuously type and type all over again, and just keep slinging the carriage. And you'll keep slinging the carriage and type and keep slinging the carriage and type and keep slinging the carriage, and before you know it, you're going to have a roll of paper, a big long thing of paper on the floor behind the typewriter of the progress of what you've been writing. Okay, it's great. On this particular method, using this roll of paper on a table, I recommend that you pull out a little extra paper off the roll first and let it hang down behind the machine on the floor. That way you don't have to be interrupted by trying to feed it. And this 6-inch wide paper is narrow enough that if you give yourself a leader, a loop of paper on the floor, the motion of the typewriter carriage back and forth won't interrupt the feeding of the paper. You might have issues with this, though, if you're using the wider paper, because it is wider and it might kind of not feed right, or the lines might get crooked. But for the 6-inch wide paper, it really is a pretty good way of rough draft typing, because you never have to stop. I've typed using this method, and I end up with a 4-foot long piece of continuous typing. And what I do with it after that is I will fold it kind of accordion style back and forth so it fits in a notebook. And from there I can put it on a clipboard, I can put it in front of the computer, and I can transcribe it into the computer and turn it into a digital format for the next phase of the writing process. Now you'll find that if you go to Napa Auto Parts and buy one of these big rolls of white paper and work with it, you'll find it's not perfectly ideal typing paper. It is a little thin and crisp, but it does make an imprint. The typewriter does. It's not the most dark imprint. But again, this is first draft writing. It doesn't have to look like a finished letter to your favorite friend or aunt or relative. It's just going to be for rough draft writing. So it's a really good way to do continuous non-stop typing when you're in that mood, when you're in the creative flow and you just can't stop. And so I would really encourage you to consider using paper, especially typewriters, whether they are electric or manual. Use a typewriter for the first draft part of your writing process, because you have an archival copy that's a record of your working methods. It's non-distractive writing. It's pure writing, no internet, no email, and it's fun. So this is Joe Van Cleve, and I'm encouraging you to write using a manual typewriter for part of your writing process. Until next time, you have a good day.